Welcome to the Deep Dive, where we plunge into the fascinating currents of knowledge, bringing you the essential insights from stacks of research and analysis. Now think about this for a moment. Have you ever heard, or perhaps even used, the argument that the apostles, those foundational figures of Christianity, wouldn't have died for something they knew was a lie?
Mm-hmm. It comes up a lot.
Exactly. And that therefore their martyrdom somehow proves the resurrection of Jesus. It's an incredibly powerful, emotionally charged claim, isn't it?
It really is. It feels very intuitive.
For many, it feels like an undeniable historical certainty, something solid that underpins, well, one of the most foundational tenets of Christian faith.
It truly is a compelling idea. I mean, the sheer conviction required to face death for a belief, it naturally leads you to think, surely they must have seen or experienced something profoundly real.
Right.
But what if the story surrounding these deaths is, well, far richer, more nuanced, and significantly more complex than that simple assertion allows? What if the traditional understanding of apostolic martyrdom as purely historical, almost like forensic proof, isn't the full picture at all? Maybe something else is going on.
That's precisely what we're going to uncover today. Our mission in this deep dive is to explore the very core of that widely held belief.
Yeah.
We're not here to debunk faith or, to dismantle anyone's personal convictions. Not at all.
No, that's not the goal.
Instead, our goal is to understand how these incredibly powerful narratives about the apostles' deaths actually functioned and evolved within early Christianity and actually across centuries.
It's a long history.
It is. We'll be journeying through some rigorous historical analysis, the truly fascinating insights of social memory theory, which we'll definitely unpack, and even the evocative verses of ancient poetry to understand how these stories came to be and what profound meanings they truly held for the communities that cherished them.
And for this particular deep dive, we've drawn on some really foundational scholarly works that offer crucial nuggets of insight. We'll be pulling key findings from Sean McDowell's meticulously researched The Fate of the Apostles. He really digs into the historical side.
Okay.
Then there's David Eastman's insightful The Many Deaths of Peter and Paul, looking at how those key stories changed. And Linda Wimmer's extensive work on martyrdom, specifically through the lens of social memory.
And you mentioned poetry.
Yes, and to cap it all off, we'll even delve into the work of the Anglo-Saxon poet Cynewulf, sort of see how it lands centuries later. When we piece together the insights from each of these sources, you get a comprehensive and, I think, quite surprising picture of how these narratives were shaped.
And what a journey it's going to be. Get ready, to discover that the deaths of these foundational figures are probably better understood as vital elements of theological memory and communal identity, rather than strictly verifiable historical events. And understanding that distinction, for you, the listener, it changes everything about how we approach not just these foundational stories, but perhaps many other historical narratives as well.
It really shifts the perspective.
So let's begin to unpack this.
Let's do it.
So, as you said, for centuries, Christian apologetics has leaned heavily on this claim. The idea that the apostles' willingness to die for their testimony proves the resurrection of Jesus occurred.
Right, it's a cornerstone argument for many.
It feels so intuitively compelling. The thought is, who would willingly go to such lengths, enduring torture and death, for a known falsehood? I mean, it seems logical on the surface.
That's a powerful point, and it's what makes this argument so emotionally potent, isn't it? It taps into a very human understanding of sacrifice, conviction, and, well, the ultimate test of belief.
Yeah.
The assertion is that nobody would willingly die for something they knew was a fabrication. And on the surface, it presents itself as a very strong, almost irrefutable argument for the truth of the resurrection.
Right.
But as we start to peel back the layers and look beneath that confident assertion, we find a much more complex historical landscape, one that genuinely invites and perhaps even demands closer scrutiny. It's not quite so simple.
And to really get into that landscape, to scrutinize it, we need to turn to Sean McDowell. Now, he's interesting because he's a conservative scholar himself.
Right.
Approaching this from within an apologetic framework.
That's correct. He's very much on the side of wanting to affirm traditional beliefs, which makes his findings particularly noteworthy.
Right. So his work, The Fate of the Apostles, is widely considered the most comprehensive modern attempt to rigorously assess the historical validity of these martyrdom accounts, even from that perspective. So what does his meticulous examination actually tell us?
McDowell's methodology is remarkably disciplined, and that's what makes his findings so significant, especially given his starting point. He sets out to categorize each apostle's death using strict historical criteria. Very methodical.
Like what kind of criteria?
Well, he asks key questions. Is there early attestation, meaning how soon after the supposed event is it recorded? Are there independent sources? Are there multiple separate accounts that don't rely on each other, giving us corroboration? And does the account exhibit contextual plausibility? Does it actually make sense given what we know about the time, the place, the political climate, the historical figures involved? It's a very forensic approach, almost like a historian detective.
Okay, a forensic approach. And what does he find when he applies that kind of rigorous analysis? Because I gather that's where some genuinely sobering findings start to emerge, right? Even for him.
Exactly. Even working within his own apologetic framework, his conclusions are indeed quite sobering for the traditional narrative, the one that says all the apostles died martyrs' deaths as proof.
So what's the breakdown?
Out of the 12 apostles, maybe plus Matthias, only the martyrdoms of James the son of Zebedee, Peter, and Paul truly rise above the threshold of what he considers plausible historical reconstruction. Just those three.
Only three. Wow. Okay, so James.
Yeah.
Where does that come from?
Right. James's death is attested in the canonical book of Acts, specifically in chapter 12, verse 2. It says he was executed by sword under Herod Agrippa III. That's relatively early, probably around 44 CE, and it's directly within the biblical narrative itself. So that one has strong footing.
Okay, that makes sense. What about Peter and Paul? They're huge figures.
For Peter and Paul, their martyrdoms, traditionally placed in Rome under Nero, are supported by very early Christian texts. Most notably, First Clement, which is a letter from the church in Rome, likely dating to the late 1st century, maybe around 96 CE.
That's pretty early.
It is. It alludes to their noble examples in suffering. Later, you get more details consolidated by Eusebius of Caesarea, the great 4th century church historian. He draws on earlier traditions. So there's a thread there for Peter and Paul.
So even for these three, the best cases, you mentioned they still show signs of theological shaping. What does that actually mean in practice? Are the accounts still straightforward?
Well, that's the crucial nuance. Even for James, Peter, and Paul, McDowell acknowledges that their stories, as they come down to us, are not just dry historical reports. They begin to show signs of theological shaping and narrative evolution, meaning the way their deaths are recounted isn't solely about recording facts like a court stenographer. It's also about how those facts were understood, how they were interpreted, and sometimes how they were, let's say, expanded upon or emphasized to convey spiritual meaning or to serve a particular theological agenda within the early Christian community.
Ah, okay.
They were remembered in ways that reinforced specific beliefs about discipleship, about suffering, about divine purpose, about following Christ's example. So the why and the how it's told starts to become as important as the what.
So if only three apostles have even plausible evidence by these strict criteria, what about the rest? I mean, the other nine. What about Thomas, Andrew, Philip, Bartholomew, Matthew, all the others we often hear about in tradition?
Yeah, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Yeah.
For the vast majority of the remaining apostles, the other nine, plus perhaps other prominent early figures like Matthias, who replaced Judas McDowell's conclusion, is quite blunt. He states the historical evidence for their martyrdoms is either weak or non-existent.
Weak or non-existent. That's quite a statement.
It is, and it's a significant finding for anyone who has maybe heard the blanket assertion that all apostles died as martyrs for their faith, as if that's a settled historical fact.
Can you give an example? Like Thomas. There's that famous story about him in India.
Thomas is a perfect example. The popular tradition, deeply ingrained in Christian imagination, says he traveled to India, preached the gospel, and was eventually speared to death for his troubles. It's a vivid, dramatic image, right?
All right.
But the primary source, the main source for that story, is a text called the Acts of Thomas. And this text dates to the 3rd century, maybe even later, so a couple hundred years after Thomas would have lived.
Okay, 3rd century, and what kind of text is it?
Well, critically, it's generally identified as a Gnostic text.
And for those unfamiliar, Gnostic implies.
Right. Gnostic here refers to a diverse set of ancient religious movements, often related to Christianity, but with distinct theologies. They typically emphasize secret knowledge gnosis as the key to salvation. Often, they held a dualistic worldview, seeing the material world as flawed or evil, created by a lesser deity distinct from the true, good, spiritual God.
So, not exactly mainstream early Christianity.
Not at all, and often viewed as heretical by the emerging Orthodox Church. The Acts of Thomas fits this description. McDowell points out it's rife with miraculous exaggeration, dualistic theology, and narrative inconsistencies. Think talking animals, incredibly fantastical miracles, things that really stretch historical credibility.
Okay.
And crucially, there's simply no corroborating Roman or regional historical records from India or elsewhere to back up this specific account of Thomas's mission and death in India. It's a fascinating story, a piece of religious literature, but it lacks external historical anchors.
So it's a story, a compelling one maybe, but written centuries later from a specific non-mainstream theological viewpoint, filled with elements that look more like legend than history. That doesn't sound like something you'd use for historical proof in a modern sense.
Precisely, and it's not an isolated case. Consider Andrew. Tradition often depicts him being crucified, famously, on an X-shaped cross in Achaia in Greece. This has given us the St. Andrew's cross we see on flags like Scotland's.
Right, is very iconic.
Very. However, that specific detail, the X-shaped cross, only emerges clearly in much later medieval sources. The earliest texts that mention Andrew's death don't include that specific, very memorable detail. It seems to be a later embellishment.
Interesting. Any others?
Or think about Bartholomew, often said to have been flayed alive and then beheaded in Armenia, another incredibly gruesome, powerful image that sticks in your mind.
Yeah, definitely.
But again, the primary accounts detailing this specific horrific death also come from later hagiographical texts, writings about the lives of saints, which often prioritized piety and miraculous elements over strict historical accuracy.
So McDowell looks at all these traditions.
Yes, he carefully evaluates these kinds of traditions, often assigning them lower historical reliability grades, like a C or a D in terms of evidential support.
C or D. Not exactly an A+ for historical certainty.
Not at all. And these low grades reflect not just a lack of external confirmation from independent early sources, but also McDowell's observation of how theological motifs like enduring horrific torture or dying in a particularly symbolic way frequently seem to override specific biographical detail in these early martyr accounts. The narrative serves a theological purpose, perhaps more than a purely historical one.
So what does this all mean for the argument we started with, the one about martyrdom proving the resurrection? It sounds like we're not finding history in the modern sense for most apostles. We're finding sacred storytelling.
That's a very good way to put it.
If these deaths were intended as historical proof for the resurrection, you'd expect something very different, wouldn't you? Consistency, maybe?
Yeah.
Corroboration.
You absolutely would. And it is precisely this pervasive lack of clarity, this inconsistency across traditions for most of the apostles, that should raise a scholarly red flag for anyone trying to use these accounts as straightforward historical proof.
Right.
If the deaths of the apostles were truly meant to be forensic evidence, evidence in a modern, verifiable sense, one would expect, well, consistency across accounts, maybe some contemporary documentation outside of purely Christian circles, and strong corroborating testimony from multiple independent traditions. Instead, what we find is what McDowell calls a shifting collection of literary motifs. You get miraculous escapes right before martyrdom, very symbolic death poses like Peter's upside-down crucifixion, visionary dreams, poetic last words. And these details often vary wildly depending on who is telling the story and when and where.
So it doesn't look like a collection of police reports or historical chronicles that you could take to court.
Not really. It looks much more like sacred storytelling, crafted for inspiration and theological teaching.
And that's a crucial distinction for you, the listener, to consider, isn't it? It's not necessarily fabrication in the sense of a malicious lie, but it's definitely not historical documentation as we understand it today. It served a different purpose.
That's exactly right. This raises an important question. If the primary purpose was historical proof, why this narrative flexibility? Why this fluid collection of details and embellishments? This sacred storytelling isn't necessarily fabrication in the sense of a deliberate deception, but it absolutely needs to be interpreted through a different lens, the lens of social and religious memory.
Ah, social memory.
Yes. It strongly suggests that the purpose wasn't primarily to establish a verifiable historical account for future generations of skeptics, but rather to serve internal community needs, spiritual formation, and identity building within the early church. It's a very different function entirely.
And that leads us perfectly into our next point, because if the historical record is, as we've seen, kind of fractured and leans more towards secret storytelling for most of the apostles, then we need to understand the function of these stories, what purpose they served for those early Christian communities. It's a shift from focusing solely on the historical fact to understanding the profound power of memory and meaning.
Indeed. And this is where it gets really interesting, I think. If the historical record of apostolic martyrdom is, as McDowell demonstrates, quite fractured and often thin,
Yeah.
the cultural and theological function of these deaths is remarkably consistent and powerful. As precise historical details perhaps faded or were never widely known or consistently reported, theological memory took firm root.
So memory takes over where history is uncertain.
In a way, yes. For early Christian communities, the deaths of the apostles were not primarily events to be documented for posterity in some kind of factual ledger. They were sacred losses to be retold, to be sanctified, and to be woven into the very fabric of the group's identity and spiritual understanding. What's truly fascinating here is the evolution of these stories, reflecting a profound truth. Martyrdom was never just about what happened. It was fundamentally about what was remembered, how it was remembered, and why it was remembered in that particular way by that community.
And that's where Linda Wimmer's research comes in, isn't it? She offers crucial insight into this dynamic, arguing that the theology of martyrdom developed not necessarily from direct apostolic testimony passed down perfectly, but from communal memory shaped by suffering, displacement, and liturgical need. Can you explain what that means? What are those needs?
Absolutely. Wimmer's work is key here. Think about the context. Early Christians lived under intermittent and often quite severe threat, first maybe from some Jewish authorities, and later, significantly, from Roman imperial forces during periods of persecution.
A very precarious existence.
Extremely. In such a world where persecution could strike suddenly and violently, the apostles became more than just historical figures from the past. They became vital prototypes, powerful examples of endurance, of faith holding firm under pressure, and of redemptive suffering. They were held up as models for how to live and, crucially, how to die faithfully in a world that often seemed hostile to their very existence.
So the story served a present need.
Exactly. As Wimmer cogently argues, and I'm paraphrasing her insight here, the stories of the apostles' deaths were shaped more by what the community needed them to mean than by what might have actually occurred. The narrative served a deeply felt spiritual and social purpose for those living now.
Okay, that makes sense.
Martyrdom, then, became a sacred symbol, a powerful, resonant image of ultimate commitment, far more than a mere forensic report of an execution. It was about shared meaning, identity, and inspiration, not verifiable data points.
That's a powerful distinction for the listener to consider. The need shaping the memory. And you can see that transformation even in the language the Church Fathers used over time. You mentioned earlier a shift in language from eyewitness terminology to more pastoral and sacrificial language.
Yeah.
What does that tell us about how these stories were being reframed?
It's incredibly telling, yes. In the writings of the early church fathers, as you move from the first century into the second, third, and beyond, we observe a distinct shift in how they speak about the apostles and their deaths.
How so?
Initially, there might be some echoes of language reminiscent of eyewitness accounts, perhaps phrases that loosely implied they saw or they testified. But this very quickly transitions or gets overlaid with language steeped in pastoral concerns and sacrificial theology.
So less about what they saw and more about.
More about what they offered. Instead of just reporting, you hear phrases like, they offered themselves willingly, they were crowned for their glorious suffering, or they followed the Lamb even unto death. The focus shifts to the spiritual meaning and the exemplary nature of their sacrifice.
The apostolic body becoming a liturgical vessel.
Precisely. The physical body that lived and died was transformed in memory into a liturgical vessel, a conduit for spiritual power and meaning within the burgeoning church. Martyrdom itself was reimagined. It became seen as second baptism, an ultimate act of purification, cleansing, and rebirth into glory. It was framed as a profound participation in Christ's own suffering and triumph. The narrative surrounding apostolic death moved decisively from a potential historical report to a profound ritual theology, imbuing their deaths with layers of spiritual significance that transcended mere historical facts.
That's fascinating. Okay, here's where it really starts to click for me. Wimmer uses something called social memory theory to help us understand this whole process. Can you break down what that is exactly and how it applies specifically to these martyrdom stories?
Yes, social memory theory is such a useful framework here. It's crucial for understanding how groups, whether families, nations, or in this case religious communities, remember, forget, and even sometimes mythologize their shared past.
It's not just individual memory then.
No, it's foundational insight, first really articulated by the French sociologist Maurice Halbwachs back in the early 20th century, is that collective memory is not passive recall. It's not like simply retrieving a file from a computer's hard drive. Instead, it's an active reconstruction. Memory is constantly shaped and reshaped by the present needs, values, and social frameworks of the group doing the remembering. We don't just remember in a vacuum.
So the present influences how we remember the past.
Absolutely. As Halbwachs famously put it, we are never alone when we remember. We always locate our memories within the frameworks provided by the society in which we live.
Can you give a simple example?
Sure, think about how your own family might tell and retell a story about a major family event, say, a big argument or a funny holiday disaster or maybe a significant achievement. Over the years, the precise details might shift, right? Some parts get emphasized because they make for a better story or teach a lesson, others get quietly forgotten. But the meaning of that event, how it shaped your family's identity or taught a crucial lesson about resilience or humor, often becomes even stronger and clearer over time.
Yeah, that happens.
That's a tiny glimpse into social memory at work on a personal scale. Now scale that up. For the early Christians who were often marginalized, sometimes persecuted, internally dealing with different theological ideas, memory was, in essence, a vital survival tool.
No.
The precise biographical details of the apostles' deaths, assuming they were even known accurately, were often less important than what those deaths meant to the community struggling in the present. They were remembered for their model value, their incredible courage, their unwavering loyalty to Christ, their endurance in the face of immense pressure, rather than for providing a detailed, verifiable biography for future historians.
So the martyr essentially becomes a kind of mirror for the community itself, reflecting their own struggles and hopes, giving them a template for how to live in their own challenging times.
Absolutely, that's a great way to put it. In this context, apostolic martyrdom stories function not as objective historical reports, but as powerful cultural mirrors. They reflected the community's deepest aspirations, their fears about persecution, their developing theology about suffering and reward.
And did the stories change as the church changed?
Yes, significantly. As the church evolved over centuries, from a small, often beleaguered, persecuted sect to a more established institution, and eventually even the dominant religion of the Roman Empire, these stories evolved right along with it. They often grew in detail, incorporating more dramatic miracles, and certainly gaining in moral clarity and theological weight, all to serve the changing needs and self-understanding of the community.
Could you give examples of that mirroring?
Sure. Take, for example, the widely recognized images we discussed. Peter's upside-down crucifixion. This became a powerful symbol of his deep humility and his feeling of unworthiness to die in the exact same manner as Christ. That resonates with Christian values of humility. Or Paul's preaching head in some later, admittedly more fantastical traditions. His head miraculously continues to speak after his beheading. What does that emphasize? Divine favor, the unstoppable power of the gospel message, even in death. These images endure and resonate across time, not because they are historically proven in a modern forensic sense, but because they powerfully embody values and theological ideas that the community held dear and wanted to transmit across generations. They mean something profound.
And this idea of collective memory, especially when it comes to religious narratives that are passed down and shape identity, leads us to Jan Assmann's work on ritual memory. He makes a distinction between communicative and cultural memory. How does that distinction help us understand this even further?
Assmann's distinction is incredibly insightful here, yes.
Sure.
He differentiates between communicative memory, which is the living, everyday recollection shared informally within a generation or two. Think of personal anecdotes, family stories, things passed mouth to mouth in recent memory. It's fluid, less structured.
Okay, like gossip or recent news.
Sort of, yeah. Then there's cultural memory, which is different. It's ritualized. It becomes embedded in texts, in ceremonies, in monuments, in art. It's highly symbolic, often institutionalized, and designed for long-term transmission across many generations.
And apostolic martyrdom moved into that second category.
Profoundly so. It transitioned decisively from whatever might have started as communicative memory, perhaps early informal oral traditions recounted in house churches, into the realm of cultural memory. It became embedded in liturgical calendars, in poems recited during communal worship, in theological treatises, in iconography painted on church walls.
So it becomes official, in a way.
Exactly. As Assmann states, cultural memory is a form of knowledge that conveys fixed points and is maintained through cultural formation and institutional communication. In other words, remembering the apostles, especially their deaths, became a profoundly ritual act. It became part of the structure of Christian life woven into the Mass or liturgy, central to the Christian calendar of saints' days, powerfully expressed through Christian art and hymns. Their deaths were no longer simply mourned as past events, they were replayed like sacred theater, becoming both doctrine and drama for the community, a constant wellspring of identity and spiritual nourishment.
So if we connect this to the bigger picture, the real power of social memory, especially cultural memory, lies in its function. It forms identity. For the early church, martyrdom wasn't just a sad event, it was a crucial boundary marker, wasn't it? Legitimizing their authority, sanctifying their suffering in a hostile world.
That's absolutely right. In an age fraught with various interpretations of Christianity, what we might call heresies, and rival sects competing for legitimacy and followers, martyr stories served a vital function. They anchored the apostolic lineage, the claim to be the true inheritors of the apostles' teaching and suffering, and perceived divine favor.
It set them apart.
It did. They provided a clear distinction, helping to differentiate the true faithful from perceived false teachers, the orthodox from the outsider. The very memory of the apostles' deaths became a kind of doctrinal glue, binding together fragmented believers under a shared heritage of blood, sacrifice, and belief. Linda Wimmer articulates this dynamic beautifully when she suggests, essentially, that the apostles were not remembered as historians, but as martyrs. Their deaths mattered more for how they were told than for whether they were true in a literal, factual sense.
That doesn't imply deception, though, does it?
No, it's crucial to understand that this doesn't necessarily imply conscious deception or fabrication. Rather, it highlights a process of profound meaning-making. It shows how the Christian imagination actively shaped the past to meet the deep spiritual, social, and communal needs of the present, creating narratives that resonated with power far beyond mere historical facts. The truth was in the meaning and the function, as much as in the event itself.
That makes so much sense when you frame it that way. We've talked about why these stories evolved, driven by communal memory and identity needs. But now let's talk a bit more about how they evolved, specifically looking at Peter and Paul.
Yeah.
You said earlier they loom largest in Christian tradition as these foundational figures.
Indeed. While James, the son of Zebedee, may be the only apostle whose death is clearly recorded in canonical scripture, the New Testament itself,
Right, in Acts.
it is Peter and Paul who truly loom largest in Christian tradition. They're often considered the twin pillars upon which much of the early church narrative, especially its expansion and its connection to Rome, rests.
Yeah, they're central.
Their supposed martyrdoms in Rome, particularly, have long been invoked as the ultimate proof of apostolic conviction, an unshakable testimony to the truth of their message, right back to that core apologetic argument we started with.
There's a but.
There is. As David Eastman demonstrates so clearly in his important work, The Many Deaths of Peter and Paul, these stories, these traditions about how Peter and Paul met their ends are far from unified. In fact, the traditions surrounding their deaths diverge wildly across time, across geography, and even across different literary genres.
They're not consistent.
Not at all. And this diversity, as Eastman argues, isn't just incidental, it's not just noise in the historical record, it reveals a deeper truth. The narratives of apostolic martyrdom were not preserved primarily to prove historical accuracy for future generations. Rather, they were shaped and reshaped to serve evolving theological, sometimes political, and importantly, communal needs of the various Christian groups telling and retelling these stories over centuries.
That's fascinating. What are some of those earliest references to their deaths? How vague were they compared to the detailed stories we often hear today, like Peter's upside-down crucifixion?
Eastman meticulously traces these early references, and one of the most significant, as we touched on, is found in 1 Clement. That letter written from the Roman Church likely around the end of the 1st century, remarkably early in Christian history.
Okay, 1 Clement. What does it say?
Here, the text alludes to the deaths of both apostles, Peter and Paul, portraying them as powerful, noble examples of endurance and sacrifice, likely in the context of persecution, perhaps under Nero. However, and this is key, even this earliest reference is remarkably vague.
How vague?
It offers no concrete details whatsoever about the exact location of their deaths within Rome, the specific method used for each crucifixion on beheading, or even the precise circumstances leading up to it. It simply gestures to their suffering and witness, invoking their memory to exhort faithfulness and perseverance in the face of ongoing challenges faced by the letter's recipients.
So, right from the start, the purpose was maybe less historical reportage and more moral example.
Exactly. The purpose seems already clear. It's not history as we would record it today, aiming for objective detail. It's edification. It's using their memory as a powerful tool for inspiring and strengthening the community facing its own trials.
And then, as time goes on, these vague references start to get more specific, more embellished, right? You mentioned texts like the Acts of Peter and Acts of Paul. They sound like they're full of dramatic details that aren't in First Clement.
Precisely. By the time we reach non-canonical texts like the Acts of Peter and Acts of Paul, which were probably written in the late 2nd century, so roughly 100 to 150 years after the apostles' supposed death, the narratives have become much more elaborate, much more richly embellished. These aren't simple, straightforward accounts anymore. They read more like, well, adventures or pious novels.
Okay, so what kind of details emerge?
For Peter, this is where we get the famous dramatic detail of him being crucified upside down. And the story adds that this was allegedly at his own request because he deemed himself unworthy to die in the exact same manner as Christ. A powerful image of humility.
Right, and for Paul.
For Paul, the story often culminates in his beheading, plausible, as he was traditionally considered a Roman citizen who would typically be spared crucifixion. But these later acts add dramatic flair, sometimes incorporating miraculous elements like, as mentioned, milk spurting from his neck instead of blood, or even more incredibly, his severed head preaching sermons post-mortem.
A preaching head. Wow. Okay, that definitely pushes it firmly into the realm of sacred storytelling rather than historical account, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. And it's crucial for you, the listener, to understand that these vivid, often fantastical details are not drawn from any known eyewitness account or contemporary Roman records.
No.
We don't have a Roman court transcript describing milk or preaching heads. Instead, they are clearly products of what scholars call hagiographic invention. Stories written about saints, hagios in Greek, intended primarily to glorify the apostles, to underscore their unique piety and divine favor, and to reinforce specific theological motifs, like humility or the power of the word, that were important to the communities telling and hearing these stories.
So the stories serve the community's values.
Exactly. As Eastman explains, these stories multiplied and diverged in response to the changing needs of Christian communities, offering different models of discipleship, authority, and resistance. They were less about documenting precisely what did happen historically, and much more about expressing what the community believed those events meant.
What's most striking to me from Eastman's work, as you described it, is that these multiple versions of each apostle's death, with their varying details, didn't just replace each other over time. You're saying they coexisted. It wasn't like one definitive version emerged and corrected the others. They all just lived together in the tradition.
That is precisely the most striking and perhaps counterintuitive point for a modern mindset, and it's critical for understanding the nature of early Christian memory and tradition. It's not a neat linear progression from error to truth or from ambiguity to clarity, like we might expect from a modern historical investigation trying to find the one true story.
No.
No. Instead, multiple, sometimes seemingly contradictory versions of Peter's and Paul's deaths coexisted and were passed down simultaneously across different regions and communities within Christianity.
Can you give examples of that coexistence?
Sure. While the Roman tradition strongly emphasizes Peter's martyrdom in Rome, as foundational for papal claims later on,
Right.
in some Eastern Christian traditions, there were alternative accounts placing Peter's death or significant activity in completely different locations, like Antioch or elsewhere in the East. Similarly, some early texts, like the Muratorian canon fragment, hint at Paul journeying to Spain after his time in Rome, potentially implying he died there, rather than being martyred under Nero in the imperial capital as the dominant tradition holds.
So conflicting accounts were around early on.
Yes, and later medieval texts would continue this pattern, sometimes introducing entirely new miraculous elements or reframing their deaths in light of contemporary political conflicts or theological debates, further adding to the layers of narrative. This very multiplicity, Eastman argues, clearly shows that no single fixed narrative existed or was universally enforced in early Christianity regarding the specifics of their martyrdoms.
So the accounts function differently.
Exactly. Eastman suggests martyrdom accounts function much more like living scripture. They were malleable, performative, and profoundly responsive to the cultural, political, and spiritual needs of the diverse communities recounting them. They weren't static historical records.
And this kind of diversity, this multiplicity of narrative, it just profoundly undermines any simplistic apologetic appeal to martyrdom as straightforward proof, doesn't it? If the stories aren't even consistent among themselves, how could they be used as definitive evidence for a specific historical event like the resurrection?
It absolutely does pose a significant challenge to that simplistic argument. if these deaths were meant to be forensic proof, unshakable historical evidence that could convince any rational observer,
Yeah.
then one would logically expect some degree of consensus, some clear, consistent tradition emerging about the core details. But as Eastman's research reveals, if Peter and Paul were indeed martyred, which is historically plausible, the early church couldn't even consistently agree on when they died, where exactly they died, how they died, beyond generalities like crucifixion or beheading, or even precisely why certain symbolic aspects of their deaths occurred or were emphasized.
And the fact that this variation was okay.
Exactly. That such significant variation was not only tolerated, but even, in a sense, revered within different streams of Christian tradition speaks volumes about the true function of these stories. Their primary role was clearly not about documenting facts for posterity. It was about generating profound meaning, shaping identity, and inspiring faith. As Eastman strongly argues, there was never a single story. Attempts to create a master narrative by later historians or apologists misrepresent the ancient evidence and the intentions behind its telling. The richness and power of these traditions for the early Christians came partly from their adaptability and their ability to serve diverse spiritual needs, not from their historical rigidity or uniformity.
So the church wasn't affirming the literal specific details then, but rather the deeper spiritual truths embedded in the stories themselves, the core message behind the variations.
I think that's a very accurate way to see it. By allowing, even fostering divergent martyrdom narratives to coexist, the church implicitly affirmed not necessarily the literal, precise historical details of the apostles' deaths, but the profound spiritual truth they were meant to convey. Such as Peter's humility symbolized in his inverted crucifixion, or Paul's unwavering courage and steadfastness in facing imperial power, or their shared ultimate witness to their faith under the immense pressure of the Roman Empire. These were the enduring themes, the core messages that truly matter and were consistently highlighted, even as the narrative details shifted.
So the stories changed, evolved, and multiplied, but the core meaning endured. That's a powerful idea for you, the listener, to consider, isn't it? The flexibility serving the core message.
It truly is. The specific narratives might shift and adapt across time and place, sometimes incorporating legendary elements, but the profound spiritual meaning they embodied about sacrifice, faithfulness, hope beyond death persisted. It's a testament to the fact that for these early communities, these stories served a purpose far beyond mere historical recounting. They were absolutely foundational to their understanding of faith, sacrifice, identity, and the enduring power of their message in a challenging world.
And this understanding of how these stories function, how they were shaped by meaning rather than just fact, leads us almost inevitably to our next point. Let's see how this evolution culminates, moving even further away from anything resembling a historical record and deep into the realm of sacred art, liturgy, and spiritual archetype.
Yes, exactly. As the centuries passed, the stories and the figures of the apostles, particularly in relation to their deaths, moved even further from the realm of historical recollection, whatever faint traces remain, and decisively into the realm of sacred art, liturgical practice, and poetic imagination.
And this brings us to Cynewulf.
Precisely. By the time of Cynewulf, an Old English Christian poet writing probably somewhere between the 8th and 9th centuries, so we're talking nearly 700 to 800 years after the apostles themselves lived and died.
Wow, that's a long time.
It's a huge gap. By this point, the apostles had transformed significantly in the collective Christian imagination of Western Europe. They were no longer just historical figures or even just martyrs in the early sense. They had become fully fledged saints, profound symbols, spiritual archetypes, figures to be venerated, invoked in prayer, and emulated in monastic life.
And in his well-known work, The Fates of the Apostles, Cynewulf doesn't seem to be attempting to reconstruct their biographies or pin down historical facts at all. It feels like he completely reshapes their deaths into a kind of poetic meditation. So this isn't a chronicle, right? Not history.
No, it's absolutely not a chronicle in any historical sense we'd recognize. Cynewulf's poem does list the apostles, and it briefly recounts elements derived from various traditions about their missions and their ultimate ends. But the focus is fundamentally not on empirical detail or achieving historical accuracy. That ship has long sailed.
So what is the focus?
Instead, he meticulously embeds the apostles into a rich symbolic landscape, a tapestry of Christian suffering and glory. He employs classic Old English poetic devices, things like heavy alliteration, kennings, intricate runic codes embedded within the poem itself, which is how we think we know his name, and the conventions of formulaic elegy to frame their deaths as both profoundly instructional and redemptive for his Anglo-Saxon Christian audience.
So the apostles are not just remembered in his verse, they are sung.
Exactly. They are sung. And in this liturgical, poetic singing, their very identity shifts again. As a piece of devotional literature, the Fates of the Apostles elevates the martyr beyond flesh and blood history, transforming them into timeless spiritual figures. Their deaths become integrated into the Church's own ongoing spiritual narrative of death and rebirth, a shared story of sacrifice leading to triumph that is constantly reenacted in the heart of the believer and the life of the monastery.
This move into poetic, ritualistic remembrance wasn't accidental then, you're saying. It served a real practical function for the Anglo-Saxon Church in its own unique historical context, right? They needed these figures in this form.
Precisely. This shift wasn't arbitrary or just artistic flourish. It was a deliberate and functional adaptation. Remember the context of 8th or 9th century England, an era of significant political fragmentation among Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, ongoing resistance from lingering pagan beliefs and practices, and a constant need for the Church to define and consolidate Christian orthodoxy, identity, and piety.
Challenging time.
Very. In this environment, the Anglo-Saxon Church strategically repurposed the apostles. They became powerful ritual figures whose suffering and triumph could be recited in communal prayer, reflected upon intensely in monastic settings where Cynewulf likely operated, and invoked for spiritual protection and guidance.
So the audience had different needs than, say, a skeptic in the first century.
Absolutely. Cynewulf's audience wasn't primarily a community seeking forensic proof of Christianity's historical claims to convince pagan neighbors or philosophical doubters. They were largely a community already committed, immersed in deep spiritual struggle, constantly searching for powerful examples of perseverance, for evidence of divine favor in their own challenging lives, and for a tangible connection to the heroic foundational past of the Church.
And this symbolic weight carried the meaning.
Exactly. In this setting, the evocative images, Peter's inverted cross, or Andrew's X-shaped crucifixion, whether historically accurate or not, held immense symbolic weight, not historical weight. Their suffering was understood as a profound, echoed Christology, directly modeling the humility, the self-sacrifice, the obedience, and the ultimate transcendence that monastic life, and indeed Christian life generally in that era, idealized. The symbol was the truth that mattered.
So martyrdom became this cosmic metaphor, transcending the physical act of death itself and becoming something much grander, almost a spiritual state.
Absolutely, and in poetic form, like Cynewulf's, this transformation is even more pronounced. The stylized cadence of Old English verse, the profound compression of narrative into evocative images, and the strong emphasis on spiritual destiny and heavenly reward over dwelling on the gruesome details of bodily pain, all these poetic choices powerfully reinforce martyrdom as a cosmic metaphor.
The apostles becoming truth.
In a sense, yes. In this elevated poetic context, they are not only dying for truth, they are almost becoming truth themselves. They embody faithfulness, sacrifice, and divine reward in a mystical sense. And Cynewulf, whose own identity as a poet is famously and perhaps deliberately obscured, known only through those enigmatic runes embedded in his verses.
Yeah, you mentioned the runes.
He even ties his personal fate, his hope for salvation, directly to theirs. In a haunting poetic gesture at the end of the poem, he asks for remembrance and mercy from God, explicitly aligning his own poetic labor and spiritual journey with their sacrificial witness. It becomes a shared offering, a connection across centuries between the saintly martyr and the pious scribe. It's a remarkable act of spiritual identification, showing how deeply these figures lived in the religious imagination.
And what's truly striking about Cynewulf's treatment, especially looking back at our entire journey through these sources, from McDowell's historical skepticism to Wimmer's social memory to Eastman's narrative pluralism, is the clear, almost complete absence of anxiety over historical accuracy in Cynewulf. He's not trying to verify anything, is he? It's just assumed.
No, not at all. There's zero anxiety about historical proof in that sense. Cynewulf's poem clearly presupposes belief, reverence, and sacred longing, not verification. The poem isn't concerned with whether a particular detail about Thomas in India or Bartholomew in Armenia is historically accurate in a modern empirical sense. That's not the point anymore.
What is the point, then, in his context?
Its profound purpose is to nourish the faithful, to inspire devotion, to provide spiritual comfort and moral guidance through the evocative power of sacred narrative and poetic form. Their deaths are not recounted to persuade skeptics or to prove a historical point to outsiders. They are recounted liturgically to deepen the faith of those who already believe, to reinforce their communal identity as inheritors of this legacy of sacrifice, and to offer hope.
So that really encapsulates the full trajectory we've traced.
I think it does. From the tentative, often inconsistent, early reports and traditions that McDowell analyzed, through the powerful lens of mnemonic theology and communal need identified by Wimmer, and the fascinating narrative pluralism and adaptation that Eastman explored in the case of Peter and Paul, we arrive here centuries later, in verse, in liturgy, in sacred metaphor. The apostles, who were once, presumably, fragile human bodies moving through specific Roman and Jewish landscapes, have become immortal archetypes, ritually summoned through poetry and prayer to sanctify the believer's own death to self and to embody the unwavering hope of resurrection for generations to come. The historical person is almost completely subsumed by the theological symbol.
So to bring it all together then, our journey through the historical, theological, and literary record suggests a very different picture than the one we started with, that simple idea of martyrdom as proof.
Definitely.
It seems the apostles did die, some certainly, and others perhaps in ways lost to history. But their deaths became these rich, evolving stories, didn't they? Not just statements of forensic fact.
That's a perfect summation.
They were remembered not primarily as historical events to be precisely documented for future verification, but as powerful narratives of meaning, meticulously shaped and reshaped over centuries to inspire faith, to affirm orthodoxy against challenges, and to unify diverse communities under a shared banner of suffering and hope. The martyr became, as you said, a mirror for the community's ideals, not merely a journalist reporting objective facts.
That's spot on. Sean McDowell's rigorous examination, as we discussed, makes it unavoidably clear that most specific apostolic martyrdom accounts lack a solid historical foundation in the modern verifiable sense. Of the original 12, only James the son of Zebedee has a death clearly documented within canonical scripture itself in the book of Acts.
Right.
Peter and Paul are supported by very early references, yes, like 1 Clement, suggesting martyrdom in Rome is historically plausible, but even those accounts are quickly colored by theological motifs and significantly expanded upon by later hagiographic traditions, making the precise details uncertain.
And the others.
The others, Thomas, Andrew, Bartholomew, Philip, Matthew, Simon the Zealot, and the rest, they largely vanish into a fog of often contradictory traditions, embellished with miraculous flourishes, and subject to numerous regional adaptations as Christianity spread. If we seek airtight biographical data or externally corroborated accounts to serve as historical proof in a modern sense, we simply will not find it for most of them.
So what do we find consistently?
What we find instead is a pervasive pattern of remembrance stories consistently shaped not by a drive for factual accuracy above all else, but by their spiritual usefulness, by their profound ability to serve a purpose for the community, by their meaning.
And Linda Wimmer's work really gave us the why behind that pattern, didn't it?
Yeah.
Unpacking the profound psychology and the very real communal needs driving this whole process of remembering.
It absolutely did. As persecution flared and theological disagreements threatened unity in the early Christian world, these communities desperately needed sources of identity, cohesion, and powerful examples of unwavering faith. Martyrdom stories served that purpose perfectly.
They filled a gap.
They did. They were not just accounts of death. They became deeply resonant templates of faith, courage, perseverance against all odds. Apostles transformed into the first saints, their suffering interpreted as a kind of second gospel, written in blood, that spoke directly and powerfully to the experiences of the faithful enduring their own struggles for survival and identity. These stories were remembered and cherished not because they were historically certain in every detail, but precisely because they were sacred, functional, identity-forming, and deeply meaningful for the survival and flourishing of the community.
And then David Eastman's analysis of Peter and Paul truly highlighted the narrative pluralism, showing that there wasn't one fixed, universally accepted story of their deaths that everyone agreed on, but many often conflicting versions, all coexisting within the tradition.
Exactly. That's such a key insight. There was never a single, unified, official account of their deaths that eliminated all others. Instead, there were many versions, each molded by the specific needs, theological emphasis, and cultural context of different communities across the vast Roman Empire and beyond.
Different stories for different folks.
In a way. Some versions emphasized Peter's humility in death, others Paul's triumphant defiance. Some portrayed the apostles unequivocally as martyrs under Nero in Rome, solidifying Rome's importance. Others placed their deaths or final missions in far-off lands like Spain or various parts of the East, perhaps bolstering local traditions or missionary narratives.
And these different stories didn't cancel each other out.
No, and critically, none of these stories completely agreed with each other on all points, yet all were, in various ways, accepted, transmitted, and revered within different Christian circles over centuries. In a culture driven more by social memory, liturgical need, and the power of spiritual meaning, rather than by modern standards of historical documentation and consistency, such divergence did not necessarily weaken belief. In fact, Eastman suggests it often enriched it, providing a flexible and adaptable framework for diverse theological expressions and cultural appropriations of these foundational figures.
And then finally, Cynewulf's poem, centuries later, shows that final, profound transformation where the apostles aren't just historical actors anymore, they're almost liturgical icons, pure figures of reverence and spiritual aspiration, completely integrated into the church's symbolic life.
Indeed. By the time we get to the fates of the apostles, they are no longer merely figures from a distant past whose stories need to be historically verified. Their names are chanted in poetic verse, their deaths are sung as examples of ultimate piety, and their memory is invoked in profound lamentation and spiritual reflection. Apostolic martyrdom in this highly developed medieval form is no longer primarily meant to persuade unbelievers through historical evidence. That purpose is long gone, if it ever truly predominated.
So its purpose is internal.
Entirely. Its profound purpose is to sanctify the soul of the believer, to offer a powerful model of dying well in faith, and to inspire deep spiritual devotion within the established Christian community, particularly within monastic contexts. The martyr's death becomes not primarily evidence of a past event, but a present, living spiritual reality, renewed and made vital every time the story is retold, sung, or contemplated in the heart of the community.
So this leaves us in a bit of a paradox, doesn't it? Going back to where we started. We began with that very compelling, very intuitive claim that the apostles wouldn't die for a lie, which is so often presented as definitive proof for the resurrection.
It absolutely leaves us in a fascinating paradox. The apostles were, without question, remembered by the early church and subsequent tradition as dying for the truth of their convictions, for their belief in the risen Christ. That memory was foundational. But the very nature of that truth, specifically in terms of its precise historical specifics regarding how, where, and when most of them died, was, as we've seen, often constructed, elaborated, and constantly reshaped through centuries of narrative development and communal memory. It wasn't simply recorded with the kind of historical precision or external corroboration we might seek today.
So the martyrdom doesn't function as proof in a modern sense.
Therefore, their martyrdom, while remaining incredibly powerful as a testament to profound belief and commitment, does not really serve as forensic proof of the resurrection in a legal or scientific or modern historical sense. It can't bear that weight.
What does it serve as then?
Instead, it serves as a powerful, enduring testament to belief itself, a belief that was shaped, deepened, transmitted, and understood through centuries of devotion, theological development, hagiographic storytelling, and poetic imagination. To insist on treating these diverse, evolved, and often symbolic stories primarily as verifiable historical certainties in a modern empirical sense is, quite frankly, to misunderstand their very purpose, their context, and their profound power in the ancient and medieval worlds.
It's applying the wrong standard.
Exactly. They were never primarily meant to be courtroom testimony submitted as Exhibit A. They were meant to be, in a sense, holy fire meant to ignite faith, inspire courage, provide ultimate meaning in the face of suffering and death, and bind the community together.
And that's a truly powerful distinction for you, the listener, to internalize. In the end, the enduring power of apostolic martyrdom lies not really in what it proves to a skeptical outsider demanding empirical evidence, but in what it evokes in the heart of the believer and the identity of the community that holds these stories sacred.
Exactly. It evokes unwavering courage in the face of overwhelming fear, profound faith in the face of lethal violence, and the possibility of deep meaning even in the shadow of death. The apostles may not have all died precisely as every detail of tradition claims. The historical record is simply too fragmented and the narratives too shaped by other concerns for us to be certain.
But
But in being remembered as martyrs and having their lives, and especially their deaths, woven into these incredibly potent, sacred, identity-shaping narratives over centuries, they taught the world and countless generations of Christians thereafter how to live with unwavering conviction and perhaps most importantly, how to face death not with despair, but with hope.
And that brings us to a final provocative thought for you to ponder long after our deep dive today. When we truly understand how deeply these stories of martyrdom were woven into identity and spiritual meaning for early Christians, how they were actively shaped by communal need and theological reflection rather than just passive historical recording, it invites us to think differently, maybe more broadly, about what truth means,
Yeah.
especially in the context of faith and foundational narratives.
Hmm.
Is a truth that inspires, that unites, that provides profound meaning, courage, and hope. A truth that helps communities navigate immense suffering and uncertainty. Is that kind of truth any less powerful or less real in human experience than a truth that is solely historically verifiable according to modern empirical standards?
That's a deep question.
It really encourages you, the listener, to reflect on how other historical or religious narratives in your own life or in other cultures you encounter might also function primarily as powerful memories shaped by communal needs and values, rather than purely factual records aimed at objective reporting. Consider that distinction between historical fact and sacred meaning in your own understanding, and how acknowledging that difference might shift your perspective on many of the foundational stories that shape our world and our lives.